Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, we're going to be ranking every ground type in competitive Pokemon. If you guys enjoy this and you want to see some more content like it, of course, like and subscribe and answer the comment question of the day. What is your favorite ground type to use in competitive this generation? I can't lie, I think my favorite is definitely either Great Tusk or Sandy Shocks. I think they've both been a ton of fun to use, though obviously a little bit partial to Garchomp was the best regional performance I've had. Yes, I've only had 2 regionals this format so far, but it technically speaking was a big contributor to the best one, so shout out to Garchomp, of course. In fact, actually, I changed my mind. It definitely is Garchomp. It's definitely Garchomp this gen. But let me know your guys' thoughts down below. With that said, though, let's get started on the tier list. So as usual, we have our S pluses. These are for Pokemon that you genuinely lose so much putting them not on your team that these end up literally being a detriment by not slotting them. This would be Pokemon like, for example, if I guess we can't really talk about S pluses without the elephant in the room, Landorus-Therian. I was trying to think of an example, and instead of thinking of one from this generation like Amoonguss or Flutterman, I fucking spoiled Landorus-T. I kept saying in my head, don't say a ground type, don't say a ground type, don't say a ground type, and of course I said a fucking ground type. But obviously something like a Landorus-Therian, for example, I mean, we should all know, truthfully, Landorus could probably get its own entire tier dedicated to it, to be completely honest, but I'm not going to, because I do think this generation actually does a good job at throwing a lot of Pokemon around its value into the game. Last generation, I think you could really only argue it was Landorus-Therian and Incineroar, and then maybe a Lecky and a Rillaboom could maybe make it as like a lower version of the S plus tier. But like, even still, I feel like those two are far and away the best mons. I think in this format though, we have a lot of other actual contenders for that slot. Stuff like Fluttermane, Amoonguss is really fucking top tier this generation. We have, I mean, when Regieleki comes back as well with this set, that's another one that's going to be up there for sure with Dynamax. Not with Dynamax, with Terastal. We have the, well, no, I was going to say Iron Bundle, but that's really more last format. It's no longer an S plus, to be honest. But we have a lot. Like, you guys clearly do know what an S plus would actually be in this format, and I do think that Landorus-Therian is definitely a part of that group of Pokemon. It's objectively one of the most splashable Pokemon ever created as far as VGC goes, and even as far as singles goes. It's so adaptable with its kit with stuff like Knockoff, U-Turn. Rocks might unironically be pseudo-viable this format, and I use that very loosely just because we've seen a lot of hazard play come up. Even Pokemon like Ting-Lu have opted to start running Stealth Rocks as a potential 4th move because they don't really need anything else, albeit it is still a very low-end 4th move compared to stuff like Fisher or Sand Tomb or like Rock Slide or Stone Edge, but it's technically speaking on a couple of teams. So the point being is that Lander really does have a lot in its kit. If you don't know what Lander does at this point, I genuinely encourage you to just look at its move pool and showdown and ask yourself, why wouldn't this mon be an S plus? I could make a whole video on Landorus, but this is the epitome of what we're looking for the S plus. We do have a couple others going down the list, but I'm gonna wait on those because I do think that they're not as clear cut as Landorus-Therian, but I do want to wait on those. The S tier is gonna be for Pokemon that are pretty low drawback, but you would still definitely fit these onto a team really well and get a lot of success. The equivalent here is probably like any given Arceus form. I do think Ground is an actual case for S plus, and this is definitely one of the strongest ones. However, I do think that even compared to Ground box arts, this one actually is not the best that we're going to see in this format, and that might allude to another S plus that we're getting into down the line. But for anyone who has already answered that question for themselves, if you guys could just keep quiet for the comments and wait until we get to that timestamp in the video to comment that you knew, I would appreciate it. We don't want some people getting spoiled on that. Thank you very much. But Arceus is a pretty versatile ground. It's one of the most unique ones as well. For any sort of box art grounds, even for ones that did not make it into Scarlet and Violet just yet. For Pokemon such as Arceus-Ground, of course, it's a special ground type that is able to calm mind sweep a lot of teams, which is very different. When you're prepping for a lot of the box arts, you're thinking of like Swords Dance Groudon or like Coil Zygarde Complete. You're not really thinking of Calm Mind Arceus though. But it's a very amazing Calm Mind Sweeper, and it benefits a lot from the Intimidate cycling this format has. It's great at breaking stuff with just Earth Power and Ice Beam. It's really all that you actually need, though you still do have the option for like SD sets with Earthquake, or E-Speed, and Stone Edge probably, or Rock Slide, and you can get a lot of mileage out of that. It's probably going to be our best actual native S tier in this tier list today, to be honest. As I said, it's a very fringe S plus in my opinion. However, at the same time, though, I do think that it is just below a couple other mons in the S plus in terms of splashability, because I think that objectively the only actual Arceus form, I guess this is kind of spoilers for when we do normal, but it should be kind of obvious. The only actual Arceus form that should be in the S plus tier, I would argue, is Arceus Normal, and I don't think that anything else actually competes with that, because Arceus Normal does benefit a lot from the item usage that it can get, and those items really do make a difference on Arceus, I feel like, in my opinion. But this is definitely, I would say, as far as this format goes in particular, I think it's a close second. I think specifically with Terrestrial, this is a very close second. Still an S plus, an S tier. But finally, though, we have the A tiers. These are going to be for Pokemon that I guess I spent 5 minutes going over 2 different Pokemon without even going through the rest of the tier list. But the A tiers. The A tiers are going to be for Pokemon that you could start to actually maybe disregard on the team, but they're still going to be important Pokemon that you should counter. For example, you don't really need to be bringing into every single team that you have. Fuck, I need to look at Team Builder for an example of this before I actually start spoiling again. Okay, honestly, a great example of this would probably be, oh, fuck, okay, never mind, I don't actually have a great example of this. Fuck, I would have had a great example of this earlier if I actually planned it. Okay, so a great example is, honestly, you know what? Current Roaring Moon would probably be a great example. I think Roaring Moon has definitely fallen off a lot as the generations went on. Or even a Pokemon like Murkrow. Murkrow is actually probably the best example I could give of this. Where Murkrow is still a really good mon you could throw on Tailwind teams, and it has a lot that it can offer, but it's going to objectively be a slot you can replace with other Tailwind options, or even just other pranks or support. The B tiers are going to be for Pokemon that you could start actually disregarding in prep. You no longer need to have like dedicated checks to these. However, you should at least know how you are personally going to play around these with your match. Because you will probably fight these in a couple games in any given laddering session. The C tier is going to be for Pokemon that specifically are meant to counter like these S pluses and S tiers. Really, it just needs to counter at least one of them, or at least have a really strong place against a lot of them. But you don't need to be suddenly some metastable or anything. D tiers are going to be for YouTuber Pokemon. You might see me clickbait a video or two with these, such as like the Dunsparces, of course, the other day, or some Flora, but they're not exactly going to be meta picks. And finally, the F tier are going to be for Pokemon that are so bad that typically I will not even touch these, unless if it's for the sake of highlighting how bad they are. With that said, Shipmon. These two just suck. This one's actually so bad, I kind of want to make an F minus, to be honest, but I won't, specifically because of the fact that the ground steel typing is not terrible. And it has kind of a place, I guess. But this one sucks. You don't need Arena Trap. It's kind of bad in this format. Between the fact that you can't drop flying types, you can't drop ghost types, the fact that also you're really slow and typically most leads can beat you pretty easily, but then it's like, okay, what do I trap? And you can't really bring this thing in easily either is the other issue. And even still, it's fairly weak. Even with Terra Ground Choice Band, it's not going to do a lot of damage. But then if you're not running Scarf or Sash, you're not really getting off an attack to begin with. And it's just like, where do you actually begin to use Dugtrio? And I think the answer, if you really want to try and use Dugtrio, is to delete your team that you built with it, because it's just that bad. I think in doubles, it is arguably one of the worst ground types that you would actually put on your team. And that might sound like hyperbole, but I promise you, when we look through the rest of the options that Scarlet and Violet actually gave us, it's not. While there's not a lot of top tier ground types in Scarlet and Violet, most of the Pokemon do sit around that middle of the road set, and like there's not really a lot of unviable grounds. So these two, I think, are arguably going to be the worst. Well, two of the worst. There's one other ground type that will make this tier. I'm looking through right now, but there's not a lot that are actually gonna make, well, two others, but one is objectively higher and one might be lower, depending on how I feel. Anyway, we have Quagsire up next. As far as specifically a ground type tier list, this thing gets a D tier. While this isn't necessarily going to be like a regulation C tier list where I might put this lower because it matches up pretty bad in the format, Quag does have a bit of a place. Just being an unaware Pokemon already is pretty decent, and the fact that this has pretty natively good Phys Def with stuff like Ice Beam, you could essentially maybe form like a Terra Fire set with like Water Absorb as well and just be a good Phys Def wall. But I do think objectively the unaware sets are slightly better with like a Yawn Recover and then Ice Beam and then Earth Power, something like that. You're just an unaware version of Gastrodon, and I think it's pretty decent if nothing else, so we'll give this thing an easy D tier. Next up, we have Donphan. Donphan is pretty cool as well, actually. This is a decent Trick Room ground type with stuff like Wide Guard support. Base 50 is pretty strong as well. You can essentially run this thing like you would with a Ting-Lu, but you can also then throw Wide Guard on it because you get this Fisher and Stomping Tantrum. You get stuff like Wide Guard support, which is pretty cool. Oh, never mind. You actually don't get Wide Guard. I don't know why. You know what? I'm thinking of a similar team that I ran with this with Toxapex. That's what I was thinking of. But even still, I mean, you could essentially just run this thing as like a budget Ting-Lu, but you also get Sturdy, which is pretty cool. Or you still have a lot of better offensive coverage than Ting-Lu with stuff like Earthquake, Head Smash. You have Knockoff, Iron Head, Player Off, Seed Bomb, Rock Slide, Trailblaze, Ice Spinner. Like, you have a lot of options in your coverage set. Even Gunk Shot and Fire Fang, like, you nearly hit like half the types. In fact, you might even hit over half the types with your coverage, to be honest. So Donphan can be a pretty good terror option on Trick Room, and its 50 speed is nothing to like disregard either. The 120 attack is pretty strong, especially if you want for like a terror ground set. This thing could be decent with AV or Band. I think it's a D tier. Camerupt is a D tier as well. This thing is probably going to be one of the best D tiers we have today. With Solid Rock, this is actually an amazing Terra option. It's a really strong Trick Room special ground type. As I mentioned with Arceus, it's pretty uncommon for a really strong special ground type to actually pop up. So most teams don't actually have strong checks to these Pokemon, which does open up the opportunity for something like a Camerupt to actually snowball a team pretty easily. With Solid Rock, you're able to just run a Choice Spec set or like an Assault Vest set and just start tearing through a lot of teams with like a Terra Water or Fire. And with the base 40 speed, while you aren't going to be slower than Pokemon like Torkoal as far as Fire type Trick Room options go, you're slower than any other viable ground type in Trick Room besides like Mudsdale, which is honestly pretty strong for you. This is definitely going to be a strong D tier for sure. Moving on. This one I think is at least worse than regular Dugtrio, but I think you could actually make a case that it could be better. I think that Alolan Dougie is objectively the worst. It's like Dugtrio, but it has all shit abilities besides, I guess, I say that actually, but Tangling Hair is kind of good. We're going to revise. I'm putting this one at the bottom now. I'm putting Whiscash at the back just because it could at least be a decent Terra option with something like a Terra Fire. You could, I guess, maybe make like a Dragonhead set work. This thing has like okay offenses to do that. No, never mind. I am going to put Whiscash at the bottom. This thing has it has a lot worse offenses than I remembered. I'm thinking of like Barboach having okay offenses for LC viable, but like this thing is still really shit. And its abilities are not great either. If this thing had Water Absorb, it'd probably be like top of F tier. But even Dragon Dance doesn't really save this thing. You could maybe go with like Dragon Dance plus Weakness Policy and like Self-Proc and Aqua Jet into Terra Flyer. That's probably about as good as you get here. Yeah, kind of a shitmon. Groudon. Okay, so Groudon is, for anyone who guessed it earlier, it's going to be our other S+. It's not as strong as the Landorus-Therian, but it is objectively still a really strong ground type. And I would argue that it has never had a better place in the metagame. When we look at one of the most viable Pokemon to come out of the entirety of Scarlet and Violet, being Miraidon, this thing is already a great immunity to that, and you can, on top of that as well, definitely invest to try and sponge stuff like a Draco Meteor, for example. If we take like an AV Groudon, for example, and we throw this thing next to Miraidon, and we start going up for like a Draco Meteor, and we go for max special attack, and we go for Groudon with Assault Vest, because you can definitely make this thing suddenly start sponging hits pretty easily, even through Hadron Engine. With the careful nature, and you just go max with Life Orb, versus Life Orb Miraidon, you're actually able to take 2 Draco Meteors even from a modest Miraidon. And while that might not seem like it at first glance when you look at the calc, it's 53 to 64. With the Draco -2 special attack, you're actually able to guarantee take 2 of these, which is pretty impressive. Groudon already has an amazing move pool. I believe that it kept Precipice Blades. If it didn't, that's still fine. Yes, it did keep Precipice Blades. Okay, so that's also really good because it's like Earthquake, but you can only hit both the opponents, and it is a stronger Earthquake, which is really fucking good. Now, obviously, the accuracy is not the best. However, we've seen people viably hit Fisher this gen. I don't think at 85 accuracy is exactly that unusable. But overall, I think that Groudon is objectively going to be one of the best mons. It pairs well with every Pastor in Pokemon. Even like Great Tusk wouldn't exactly be a terrible partner. A lot of teams do struggle to have consistently strong ground checks, and with stuff like Terrify or Groudon, you could make that into an absolute amazing check to a lot of common Tusk checks, because you have the Sun Boost as well, and you could go for something like a Heat Crash, which actually, I don't know if Groudon kept Heat Crash. I don't think it did. No, it did. Heat Crash was cut. I mean, even still, you still get like Fire Punch, or even Terra Blast could be a decent option at that point, but I would probably just go with Terra Blast on a Fire Punch for the 5 base power less, but always keeping the grass check. The point being is this is objectively speaking going to be a strong S+ in this format. I don't think we've ever had a better Groudon format in history, and this might arguably be one of the only formats ever where this thing would, genuinely speaking, maybe have more viability than Kyogre. I don't think it's a guarantee. For what it's worth, I think Kyogre is still one of those mons that's so fucking brainless, and it's still objectively hard to fuck up, and you could throw it next to like Miraidon, for example, to where you could actually just justify spamming Kyogre Miraidon as lead, and then throw in like a bundle, for example, for speed control, and just start rain spamming teams. And I think that could be really fucking obnoxious. However, at the same time though, Groudon will have objectively a strong place in the meta just for countering that core. You could throw this on with something like, as I said, like a Roaring Moon, for example, or a Fluttermane, and you're going to get so much fucking mileage out of that. So I do think that Groudon is objectively speaking an S+. I think that you might even be able to make a case for better than Landorus, but the one reason I'm putting Landorus above is the fact that this does not take up a restricted slot, and Groudon does. And that's the only reason that it is getting that ranking. Next up, we have Gastrodon. Gastrodon is a strong A tier. This is a really amazing Storm type Pokemon in this format. Gastrodon has proven to be a really consistent check to stuff like the Palette scores that have been going around. It's also just a really good Terra Fire option. It's really hard to kill, actually, if you don't have a strong ground type, which, as I said, there's a lot of really average ground types, but there's very few that are actually at the top of the format. just because of the fact that a lot of the format for ground typically skews to like the B through D range, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But right now we only have a couple ground types that actually do consistently check it. And even still, Gastrodon does check that pretty well. Despite being weak to ground types, it does typically have the ability to take an Earthquake or two. And you could usually just kill them with Ice Beam for stuff like Garchomp that has 4 times weakness, or Great Tusk that has no Spadef. So it's definitely, speaking of really strong A tier, it's probably going to be one of the only A tiers in the list today, to be honest, just because of the nature of how few upper tier grounds there are. But it is objectively speaking one of the strong, actually there's going to be like one other, but it is objectively still a really strong ground type. Garchomp is going to get an S tier. This will probably be one of the lowest S tiers for what it's worth, but it is a really strong option. Unlike something such as a Great Tusk, you can actually outpace Bundle with Booster with this if you throw it on the Tailwind team, which is pretty cool. So this already has a strong there over running Great Tusk. It's also a really strong offensive option with the 102 speed, even outside of Tailwind. That is an amazing speed tier. You get stuff like Rock Slide. You can also throw with like Dragon Claw. Terra, Ground, and Rock are pretty strong options offensively. Meanwhile, you have Terra and Steel for defensive merit, as you can now turn yourself into an Ice and Fairy Resist, which is pretty cool. Overall, definitely a strong S tier. One of the better offensive grounds for sure this generation has. Hippowdon's going to get a C tier. Really strong defensive sand option. We've seen a couple sets popping up, like the Fissure sets, or just being like a really good Yawn support Pokemon. But Hippowdon definitely is just Ting-Lu Light, in my opinion. It's overall a really good ground type, I think, in Scarlet and Violet, but it's just kind of outclassed for Sand by Tyranitar because Tyranitar has the native Spadef boost. It's outclassed as far as ground types go, both defensively by stuff like Ting-Lu and offensively speaking by stuff like Great Tusk, which would provide a similar like Fizdef tanky role for offensive ground. It does have recovery, which is pretty cool, but at the same time, you do have such bad floor moveset syndrome with Hippowdon. You really do need like 6 or 7 moves at once to be super viable. So I'm going to give it a C tier. Crocodile, this thing also gets a C tier actually. I'm going to put it above Hippowdon though. Really strong Intimidator at the very least, but at the same time, there's a lot of better options. Stuff like Salamence, Gyarados, Arcanine, all easily outclasses Pokemon just for stuff that are currently out in the format. And that doesn't even get into unreleased stuff like Landorus, which will objectively just outclass. You can make it, actually the Taurus forms, at least for Water and Fire, also definitely outclass. Then even looking at other unreleased stuff, Hisuian Arcanine will at least give competition, just because of the fact that this does have a lot of a good anti-meta presence against a lot of strong offensive cores. I don't think it's going to outclass though, but it's at least an option, I guess, that does now get added to the format, which will compete with usage even further, because Hisuian Arcanine, despite being 2 base speed lower, is a really strong Tailwind option for Intimidate, and it's also going to be a really strong Terra Pokemon. So again, like, this is like what, the 5th or 6th best Intimidator you can go with. It's a C tier. Still really good Mon, but it's objectively a C tier. Lando I. Lando I, I'm going to be honest, I forget where I put this thing I'm flying, but I'm pretty sure I put it in the S tier, and I do agree this is an S tier. It's slightly weaker than Arceus-Ground, despite the fact that Arceus-Ground does have the restricted slot issue. At the same time, though, I do think that if nothing else, that Landorus-Incarnate is still a lot lower of a viability compared to Arceus-Ground. Arceus-Ground having significantly better bulk, no 4 times weakness, the fact that you also do have a 120 speed, which is really viable, the fact that Arceus-Ground has recovery built in, which is also fairly viable to run on Arceus. The Sheer Force Landorus is still amazing. It can still run items like Life Orb and be viable. This thing still has a 101 speed, which is still incredible in the format. I do just think that Arceus-Ground will be a slightly better option. Even despite the fact that this thing does give up a restricted slot in the team, I don't think it really matters in the case of an Arceus because it just is objectively that good of a Pokemon. For a lot of other Arceus forms, it'd be one thing, but Arceus-Ground with having Ice and Ground built in without needing Terra is just so damning for a lot of teams, and most will not have good counterplay for it. So Lando I gets an S tier for sure. Palossand, this thing gets a D tier. I'm putting this thing right at the bottom of D tier actually. If Water Compaction was like an immunity such as Wellbake Body, which makes no sense by the way that Wellbake Body has an actual immunity, but Water Compaction does not. I think it's really inconsistent, to be honest, but if this thing did have an objective water immunity, this would honestly be a really strong C tier. It might even be a B tier, in all honesty, because of the fact that it would have a water immunity, taking advantage of stuff like Muddy Water, while also being able to, of course, boost your Fizdef and just start being a really strong AV Mon that way. But sadly, though, this thing doesn't. It's a D tier. Unfortunate. Moving on, we do have Mudsdale. Now, Mudsdale, honestly, I think we can make a case for Mudsdale being like the top of C. Purely, I think, just we don't really have a good B tier looking at it. Actually, no, we do have. I think I've come around on one Pokemon a lot actually since making my regulation C tier list. That will probably be our one B tier. But Mudsdale is a very close B tier. It's gonna lean in C though. This is a really good Trick Room ground with stuff like Assault Vest sets or like an Iron Fence Body Press set. It's a really decent physical tank for Trick Room. And with pure ground typing plus stamina, you can actually throw a Citrus Berry on this pretty easily and just start chewing through any physical hits pretty effortlessly. One thing that does keep Mudsdale out of the B tier though is the fact that a lot of stuff like Haze and Clear Smog are running around because of Dondozo being so good, which does actually hurt a lot for Mudsdale's gimmick of stamina, because that was like the one reason you'd run this thing. But now most teams will have counterplay for that sort of boosting, and despite the format leaning so physically heavy, Mudsdale can typically be broken after a single boost. It's really once you get like the second boost that Mudsdale becomes a problem, but most teams will be able to get around that boost. So sadly, it is going to land itself in the C tier today, which is really unfortunate because I think that Mudsdale had a lot of potential to be good, but it's just barely missing out. Sandaconda, this thing can get the bottom of D tier. This will probably be like the genuine bottom of D tier. Sandspit is a kind of cool ability as well as Shut Skin with like Coil, but again, similar to Mudsdale, it does lose out a lot from not being able to keep a setup pretty reliably. The Glare is objectively really good support, and this thing does have some really good abilities. Really, all of its abilities are kind of viable. But overall, I don't know. I don't think this thing is great. It has a lot of good Terra options similar to Donphan, but the issue being is the 71 speed is a lot worse for Trick Room, and it's a little too slow for Tailwind. So it's going to get like the bottom of D. It's borderline an F tier, but I think that Glare kind of saves it. Moving on, we do have Ursaluna, which Ursaluna is actually going to be the only ground type that is going to pass Arceus in the S tier. Now, I'm a little bit hesitant to put this thing in the S+. I don't think it would be exactly too outrageous though, but Ursaluna will redefine Trick Room in my opinion. I think that Trick Room will become like a very hard meta staple as a hard Trick Room team, where you have like no fast options such as Flutter Mane. Not to say that you can't run them, but I do think it will finally get a really viable hard Trick Room archetype because of Ursaluna's presence in the format. With stuff like Terra Ground, Terra Steel, Terra Fire, Terra Fairy, Terra Normal, all being fairly viable options, with Terra Fire, for example, being a great way around Burn, though you'll probably just run like AV Flame Orb, not AV Flame Orb, Flame Orb Guts anyway. But Terra Fire could be a decent option for like bulletproof sets to be really strong. You have stuff like, for example, the Terra Fairy, which is just meant to be a good fighting check while also just being a good defensive typing. You have stuff like Terra Ground and normal for stabs. You have Terra Rock for just coverage, as well as maybe being a good partner next to Tyranitar in Trick Room. You have stuff like Steel, which is just meant to be a good ice check for this, as well as, well, for Steel, for Ice, truthfully, you'd probably just go with Fire at this point, because you would also then not keep your fighting weakness. But the point being is it has a lot of good options. Overall, this will be an amazing Assault Vest option. It's going to be a decent Sword Stance option too with Guts. I think this will truly redefine how Trick Room is ran, and I don't think it's an understatement either. If anything, I think I'm under-tiering this, to be completely honest. This thing could maybe deserve an S+, but I don't want to put it there just yet, purely because the fact that I think the other three Pokemon have in some way, shape, or form proven their success in other previous VGC formats, even if not this generation, and I don't exactly think their viability or their roles in the format will change in any way, shape, or form. So I'm hesitant to put in the S+ yet, because that's a pretty big jump to make for a Pokemon that has never once touched the official format. However, at the same time though, I do think that Ursaluna, if any Hisuian Pokemon can reach the S+, I think this is the Pokemon to do it. It's a very, very close S+ in my opinion. I'm really looking forward to seeing Homemon's released, because this will actually genuinely redefine the landscape in my opinion. Definite S+, definitely S tier for sure. Great Tusk. This is an S+. It's going to be the weakest one, but it is objectively still there. Even in this format, Great Tusk has proven to be a phenomenal option, whether it's on Sun teams that are just an adaptation of the Semper builds, or if you're throwing this thing on Tailwind teams with Talonflame, which are still fairly viable. This is an amazing option to counter the Ruins, which typically the defensive ones at the very least do run Terra Poison, so you can essentially go with either of your stabs, and you're pretty much always handling the Ruin Pokemon. There's pretty much no type that would actually like genuinely check both unless you're running Choiced, which is Scarf Great Tusk. Speaking of that, also a fairly viable option on Great Tusk in this format. It's a really good Scarf on Tailwind, being able to outpace a lot of different Pokemon such as Flutter Mane that it can no longer, well, that it could not do previously. Still have a lot of merit with Life Orb, Focus Sash, even Assault Vest is still kind of viable. Objectively speaking, this is one of the best physical breakers in the tier right now. I would say this is the only current meta S+ Pokemon as far as grounds go. Well, actually no, there's one other that will reach it. Ground definitely, as I said, it has like the most extreme examples of ground types, but there's very few that actually do sit at like the higher tiers. For example, we right now have 3 that are actually released in the higher tiers. Home will introduce a lot of amazing ones, don't get me wrong, but currently we only have 3, and there's only going to be one other that will actually make that benchmark. Well, actually 2 technically, but objectively though, regardless, definite S+. Sanding Shocks. Sandy Shocks can definitely get a B tier. I did actually forget about this one. This wasn't going to be an A tier. This is a B tier. Sandy Shocks has fallen off a lot, in my opinion. I think that once we started getting a lot of better Pokemon, such as the Ruins, Sandy Shocks did prove that it is no longer a consistent playstyle to run the Espathra Shocks build. It's still not a bad booster speed option, and Gravity can still work with stuff like Chi-Yu. I just don't think that we're really running it for Hypnosis anymore with the Espathra. Chi-Yu is definitely going to be like the best partner to take advantage of this now, though, because it can counter stuff like different but yeah, you could use like Terra Grass G with Terra Blast to counter like different grounds. You could obviously use Terra Grass Sandy Shocks as well for that. You also have Chi-Yu to counter stuff like different grass types that would otherwise sponge your stabs. Overall, definitely a really strong core, and it can still definitely be a good option. I just think that it's going to be a B tier as all. Iron Treads. I've given Iron Treads a lot of shit, but I'm going to be honest, I think this is actually going to also be a B tier. I think that I've used Iron Treads enough to where Iron Treads unironically does kind of have a place in this meta. I do think this is a decent Tailwind option. I think it's a pretty good option as well with like different Terra builds. Overall, I think it's a little bit hard to really disregard Great Tusk's Iron Treads' place in this current format, just because of the fact that if nothing else, this is a decent option to resist stuff like Iron Bundle. Well, it's a decent ground that can be neutral to Iron Bundle, which is nothing to understate. It's a great booster energy option as well, because unlike something such as a Garchomp or a Great Tusk, it can get the speed boost that something like a Scarf variant of one of those would do, but it's not only faster, but it's also not locked either, like those two Pokemon would be with a Scarf. You pair this thing next to stuff like an Iron Bundle or like a Talonflame, and you can get a lot of mileage out of this. And I do think that unironically, Iron Treads might actually have been one of the most slept on Pokemon from Series 2, and I'm kind of shocked we didn't see more results from it. We've seen a lot of like day 2 performances with this thing being pretty decent. If I remember correctly, I think we've seen like 2 or 3 at this point. I know I can at least distinctly remember one where it got 9th place, and I'm pretty sure there's a couple others as well where it at least made day 2. Even still, I do fully anticipate this thing to make a couple other day 2s, if not top cuts outright in this format. I think this is a pretty good format for it, and I'm curious to see where Iron Treads does continue to go, because I do think this was actually a very slept on Pokemon in Series 2, and I think that Regulation C and onwards will prove to be an actually somewhat okay format for this Pokemon. If Excadrill ever does come back though, this thing will outright become unviable, like completely unusable, but until then, it's at least going to be a kind of usable mon. Objective B tier. Ting-Lu. This is going to be our last test plus. I would argue this is at least better than Great Tusk. I do think that Ting-Lu will be a little worse than Groudon and Lando though. Definitely objectively than Lando, but I think it's still going to be worse than Groudon. Despite the fact that Ting-Lu does not require a restricted slot, and it does still put up a ton of field presence. At the same time though, I do think that once we start seeing a lot of these better Intimidate mons like Landorus come to the field, we're going to start seeing just like AV Lando or just a lot of good AV mons next to Landorus, and they're just going to sponge hits that way. Ting-Lu also, objectively speaking, I mean, it's not a terrible partner for like a dual ground core with Lando. I don't think it's a terrible option, but at the same time though, I feel like the Ting-Lu will be relegated a lot off of the balance builds and is instead going to be pushed to like hard stalls, which isn't exactly terrible for it. It could be a great partner with something like a Dondozo, but at the same time though, I feel like Ting-Lu, definitely when we compare to a lot of these home mons, we're just going to get a lot of good breakers that can actually shatter it a lot easier. Stuff like Ursaluna, for example, could just Terra Fighting and Massacre that. We have Sheer Force Lando, which will still do a ton of damage to Ting-Lu. While it's not going to exactly immediately break it, Landorus-Incarnate with Sheer Force versus a Ting-Lu could definitely do a lot of damage. If we pull up like a Salt Vest Ting-Lu, for example, and we just... Oh, I clicked on the ability. And we just pull up even like an Earth Power with the Life Orb. This could prove to be a pretty strong hit versus Ting-Lu at the very least with like max HP, max BF, careful, just in case they adopt that. I mean, Earth Power actually does like nothing, but Focus Blast on the other hand could actually do some serious damage. It's 33 to 40% right there, and with like a Terra Fighting, you can make that a 2 kill pretty easily. On top of that as well, if they go for like the Terra Poison, which they've typically been doing for a Fairy Resist, the Earth Power is now doing 38 to 45, which is pretty good, and you could also again just Terra Ground to make that be your superior option. So I do think that Ting-Lu is definitely going to still be a great sponge of stuff like Lando I, which will still have a lot of value in this format. But at the same time, though, there's a lot of options that I do think that will be coming into home, such as Basket Legion and other Pokemon, that I do think will actually hurt Ting-Lu's usage a lot. It's still going to be a great option, but it's objectively going to be one of the lower end S tiers, S pluses. Toedscruel. Toedscruel is a pretty okay option. It's going to be the top of F tier for sure. I think a Toedscruel, if nothing else, does actually have kind of a place with just the utility it provides with stuff like Spore, Trick Room, etc. But Mycelium might really does keep this thing out of being like a strong B tier option, and I do genuinely mean if this thing had even a second ability, I don't care what it was, as long as it was not hindering, this would objectively probably be like a B tier Pokemon in my opinion. The support it provides is really fucking incredible with Trick Room. I think this also gets Rage Powder if I remember correctly. Let me actually double check, because this thing gets some really incredible, yes, so it gets this thing wait, hold on. Yes, this gets Rage Powder, this thing gets Spore, Taunt, Toxic Spikes, Toxic, Trick Room, you can get Reflect and Light Screen, Leech Seed. You get like, this is basically like meant to be one of the best support move pools in competitive history. Does this thing get Pollen Puff as well? If this thing gets Pollen Puff, it does not get Pollen Puff. That's unfortunate. Wait, hold on. I'm on Toedscruel. Does Toedscruel get Pollen Puff? No, it does not. Okay, if Pollen Puff was on the moveset, I would genuinely actually consider maybe putting this thing into D tier. But even still, this thing gets a lot of good stuff outside of its support move pool. Stuff like Knockoff. Well, I guess like non-damaging support, I should say. Stuff like Knockoff is really good. Rapid Spin could be okay, I guess, with the T-Spike meta being actually kind of viable. Mirror Coat is pretty good for special offense. Like, I do think this thing unironically would be a strong B tier. Like, a strong B tier. Probably even top of B tier, I would go as far as saying, if it just had an okay ability. That's all it needed. But overall, though, sadly, it got cocked by Mycel and Might. Finally, we have Clodsire. Clodsire definitely gets a D tier. This thing can at least get above like Palossand and Sandaconda. This thing is just kind of like a budget Gastrodon, but slightly bulkier. However, I do think that the pre-terra typing of Water Ground at least is better than the Clodsires. Though at the same time, you do have merit at the very least in getting a T-Spike immunity, which is pretty cool pre-terra. With Water Absorb Terra Fire, you're actually pretty hard to kill yet again. Clod's really just like a shitty Gastrodon though. I would recommend just using Gastrodon objectively over it. And if you really want to use the other Water Ground being Gastrodon, not Gastrodon, Quagsire, at the very least you do have the Unaware ability to make it use. But Quagsire and Gastrodon are both just better versions of this, though Clod definitely has a lot more speed at the very least. And its HP stat is so fucking massive, you could actually maybe justify this in certain archetypes as like a really good speed F wall. But overall, that's going to be our ground type tier list today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see some more content like this, of course, like and subscribe. You could see some more bonus content, of course, if you become a channel member today, where we just released our Ruin Pokemon to Master Ball video, which went up. And make sure, of course, you join the channel members, because for the next 24 hours, we're going to be pulling our first discussion video that is going to be coming up starting in the second week in May. With that said, of course, I would like to give a massive shout out to our channel members currently, being Josh K. Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Matt O'Shea, Bbat, On Its Purr, Timo Mueller, Bonzi, Bambambi, Rao Plays, Obo, and Johannes B. Your guys' support is greatly appreciated, and the button will be down below to just join if you want to do so. With that said, it's been Liv, and I will see you guys in tomorrow's video. Until then, peace out, guys.